Hey folks, I hope everybody's having a good week so far. Today I'd like to go ahead and just basically outline a strategy for dealing with hair loss, whether or not you've been fighting hair loss for a while or whether or not you're a complete beginner. But this guide is mostly aimed at people who are just discovering now that they have male pattern baldness and they don't even know where to begin because there's just so much bullshit out there online. So I want to create this guide to give people just a step by step informative guide on what to do if you start losing hair, and also what to do like as far as taking the next step if the previous step did not work. So going over the overall strategy of a hair loss attack plan, you have to know what your weapons are, the weapons at your disposal for fighting male pattern baldnesses. Before I go over any of these, I want to say that your biggest enemy is DHT. That's dihydrotestosterone, and that is basically a derivative of testosterone. Your body converts testosterone to DHT through the alpha-5 reductase enzyme, and this is the hormone which really is bad. This is the main cause of male pattern baldness in about 99% of people who suffer from hair loss, especially men. So you have four categories for fighting hair loss, and the first two are pharmaceuticals. You have the anti-androgens and the hair growth stimulants, and those are what you usually want to begin with. But beyond that, you also have surgery as well as non-drug and non-surgery options, which I'll be getting to at the end of this video. So, sorry, I had to take a drink there. So going over the first two, you have finasteride and dutasteride, and these drugs are mostly similar. They are indirect anti-androgens. They don't directly go after the DHT hormone, but rather they indirectly inhibit it by inhibiting the alpha-5 reductase enzyme. And that's important because there's a lot of alpha-5 reductase activity on the scalp as well as on the prostate. So that's what these drugs are mainly prescribed for, which is for enlarged prostate as well as male pattern baldness. Now, finasteride inhibits one type of the alpha-5 enzyme, whereas dutasteride inhibits two types. And even though they work very similarly, dutasteride is seen as the more powerful drug. But of course, being a more powerful drug, there's also a greater risk of side effects. But the studies typically show that dutasteride inhibits about 30% more DHT than finasteride. Although these are both definitely viable options for people who want to tackle the androgen problem with hair loss. Now, beyond that, you also have the topical anti-androgens like RU5841 and CB0301, and both of these work pretty much the same, as in they actually directly inhibit androgens on the scalp, and that's not just DHT but also testosterone. And that's important to point out because even though testosterone itself isn't that damaging to the hair, there are some studies that show that testosterone has a slightly necrotic effect on the hair. It's only about 1/8 as damaging as DHT, but for some people who are very sensitive to male pattern baldness, that might be something desirable. So these are experimental drugs, so proceed with caution. We don't know the long-term effects of them, so they're not a preferable first option, but they might be a desirable option for people who cannot start with the alpha-5 enzyme inhibitors, which I'll be getting into in a moment. And for the next category of pharmaceutical options, you have stamoxetine and minoxidil. Now, stamoxetine is a relatively new treatment. There's some evidence behind it, and basically the way it works, without getting too deep into the semantics behind it, is that stamoxetine prolongs the growth phase of the hair follicle. And everybody, regardless of whether or not they have male pattern baldness, their hair follicles are going to go through cycles of falling out or growing in, and then stamoxetine basically just prolongs the growth cycle. And as far as hair growth stimulants go, it's fairly weak. And the reason why I bring it up mostly is because the chemical itself is an excellent solvent for topical anti-androgens like RU5841 and CB0301, and that's what I mainly use it for. But I think it's worth noting, even despite that, just because the fact that it works at all, even a little bit, makes it unique, because 99% of the stuff you see on the market is just total snake oil. And the next one is minoxidil, and this is a much more conventional treatment. It's available over the counter in the USA, and I think most of the EU. I think it's available only by prescription in Canada and Australia. And the mechanism of action is a little bit mysterious, but we do know it works as a hair growth stimulant. It's not an anti-androgen, but it grows the hair in spite of the fact that there are androgens attacking it. And because of that, it could be a decent adjunct treatment, but it shouldn't be seen as a standalone treatment just because of the fact that it's not actually tackling the problem of androgens on the scalp. So the next option people have are surgery. You have FUT or FUE, and I'm going to get into all that in a moment right there. But surgery should not be seen as a as a first choice for people. You want to go ahead and try the pharmaceutical choices first, and then lastly, I want to get into the non-drug and non-surgery options, and that's for the people who, for whatever reason, cannot use the pharmaceuticals and they can't afford or just do not want to do surgery. So now that's out of the way, let's go ahead and just get into the steps. So, all right, take another sip of water real quick. All right. So, step one, you are losing your hair. So the first thing you want to do is that you want to go ahead and start on finasteride, oral finasteride. And finasteride is available in two different forms. You have Proscar, which is the 5 milligram tablet, and Propecia, which is the 1 milligram tablet. Now, these are both the exact same drug, but usually I find that it's helpful to ask your doctor about Proscar instead of Propecia, because Proscar is much cheaper and you can actually quarter it so that it's 1.25 milligrams, which is roughly the same. And if you have some issues with finasteride, or if you're worried about side effects, you don't even have to use it at that dosage. You can actually get Propecia and maybe even quarter that and use it at a quarter of a milligram every single day or every other day. And that's totally viable, and it's the dose that they use in a lot of countries, like in Korea and I think in a few other Asian countries. And it's not that much weaker than using the full dose of finasteride, just because of the fact that finasteride has diminishing returns. And so that might be like a good way to start with it. And once you build your confidence up, you can go ahead and use more finasteride. And a second option is minoxidil. And of course, I do not recommend this as a standalone treatment, but this could be a good adjunct treatment for finasteride. So this is not something I would consider a first step necessarily, but I am putting it in the first step category nevertheless, because it's something that people may use first, whether it be through like poor information or just, because they want to use something that's readily available and that they know that works. And minoxidil used with finasteride is more effective than using finasteride alone, although I do want to caution people against like relying on minoxidil too soon, because for one, finasteride is a perfectly viable standalone treatment. And anything you get with minoxidil will not be maintained with finasteride. So if you use finasteride, and if you use minoxidil, anything you get with it will fall out, even if you are on finasteride. So just keep that in mind. And of course, there's also stamoxetine. This one's a little bit more obscure. It's a little bit more expensive than finasteride, but a lot of people who want to use a hair growth stimulant don't want to use something that their hair follicles are going to get addicted to, like minoxidil. And even though it's not as strong, I find that it doesn't actually cause like dramatic shedding if you stop using it for like a few months. In fact, a lot of the means of application suggest like using it in cycles, like 3 months on, 3 months off. So that might be a good option for people who don't want to use minoxidil because of the risk, or they may be allergic to minoxidil, or they don't like having to deal with like the dandruff that they get from minoxidil and all that stuff. So. All right, so you've been using that. Let's say it's been like 6 months or so, because remember, you want to give this stuff some time to work before you determine whether or not it works or not. So let's say that 6 months later, you find out the finasteride isn't really working. And this is rare. I imagine like fewer than 10% of people, I imagine that 90% of people who use finasteride will probably be able to use finasteride and like not have any issues with hair loss for at least like another decade or so. The next option would be to use either a more powerful oral anti-androgen like dutasteride, or rely on the experimentals like RU58841 and CB, which are the topical anti-androgens. Now, dutasteride is a little bit more powerful than finasteride. Like I said, it inhibits about 30% more DHT, so that might be a good option for people who are suffering from very, very aggressive male pattern baldness. And as far as the topical anti-androgens go, they're very powerful, and you may even want to like consider combining dutasteride with a topical anti-androgen. That's probably the most the safest treatment you can use if you want to like make sure that you completely avoid male pattern baldness. But of course, you have to keep in mind that you don't want to like jump on these really, really strong treatments right away, because there's a chance that like you don't need them, and hair loss is a lifetime commitment. So anything that's going to be like more inconvenient or like like put you at more risk for side effects isn't going to be very viable for something that you have to deal with for the rest of your life. So The step three, of course, is transplant and surgical options, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later in the video. And of course, step four, that's going to be if transplant and drugs are not an option. And again, that's something I'm going to cover at the end of the video. So moving on. Let's go over the finasteride side effects. So if you're doing step one, let's say you start finasteride and you find out that you can't actually use it because you have side effects, let's go over some of the possible side effects. But before I go over them, I want to go ahead and mention that side effects with finasteride are extremely rare. Do not believe the hype online. It affects only about 2% of individuals, but the side effects are legit. They do exist. There's no such thing as a drug or a treatment with no side effects. So you have erectile dysfunction, and what causes this is not known exactly. It's probably isn't because of the lower DHT, because DHT has very little role in human tissue outside of the prostate and the scalp. But I think one theory that seems to make sense is that since your DHT is being suppressed, your testosterone tends to go up a little bit, so that increases the risk of aromatization, which is when testosterone converts into estrogen. So I think that some people may have slightly elevated estrogen, and that may give them side effects. But that being said, I want to say that you shouldn't try to counter those side effects with an aromatase inhibitor like Arimidex, because those drugs are very bad for cholesterol levels. They really can't be used long term, so you're going to be putting yourself at a greater risk of health problems if you do that. And of course, low libido, which can be linked with erectile dysfunction as well. Sometimes the two are confused. Depression is another listed side effect, but there's a chance that your depression isn't because of the finasteride. So, or if you do have depression, finasteride can make it worse. So if you do suffer from depression, that's just something to keep in mind before beginning treatment. And a much less common side effect is gynecomastia, and that goes into what I was talking about the elevated estrogen levels. I mean, if it does raise estrogen, it's really typically not that high. It's like maybe going to be about 9% at most. But for some people who may be very sensitive to gynecomastia, that can happen. But it's rare, and it sucks. It's not something you want to happen to you. I mean, typically surgical options are the only way to reverse it. So if you do get gynecomastia, you may want to consider either a topical anti-androgen or other treatment options. So while you're on your hair loss journey, regardless of what step you're on, you want to make sure you avoid certain pitfalls. So like I said earlier in the video, you want to make sure that anything you're using, you give at least 3 to 6 months to use before to work before you decide whether or not it's working and whether or not you should go to the next step. So when you begin a treatment, what usually happens is that the old hair will fall out to make way for newer, healthier hair. So the initial shed that people get from treatment, whether it be from finasteride or minoxidil, that's actually, it seems paradoxical, but that's actually a good thing. That's a sign that the drug is actually working. So you want to stick with it, just deal with it, and not panic over it. I mean, that is going to be temporary, and the initial losses will be replaced with gains. So don't think that the treatment isn't working or things are getting worse if you start shedding. I mean, just accept the fact that that's just a necessary step you have to accept if you want to fight male pattern baldness. And of course, not giving drugs enough time to work. A lot of people they think that these drugs work miracles. They don't. They take time. Male pattern baldness is a slow process, and fighting male pattern baldness is also a slow process. So make sure you give these drugs several months to work. I mean, the hair grows at a slow rate, so it's going to be a while before you see whether or not the effects of these drugs are having the desired effect. And I talked about this a little already, but being afraid of finasteride, and I say that because there's just so much fear-mongering online about finasteride, and it's interesting because, finasteride, I think it first appeared in 1992, maybe even earlier when it was first approved for benign prostatic hyperplasia, and the side effects were known back then, and, some people got side effects, it was no big deal, but it wasn't until the late 2000s when we started hearing a lot of hype about it, and you'd think that, people would be complaining about these, really awful side effects if much earlier if they were legit. And there's a lot of forums and self-help and self-pity forums about finasteride, and a lot of them have heavy links to these law firms which are trying to sue Merck, the developers of finasteride. So they're financially motivated, and you'll notice that a lot of these people who are talking about how terrible finasteride is, they typically have pre-existing health problems that could be contributing to what they think are side effects caused by finasteride. Most notably notably, a lot of them are depressed, and a lot of people treat depression by overeating and binge eating, and they get obese, and then they develop type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes can cause a lot of the health, the sexual side effects that people associate with finasteride, because it can cause nerve damage. And depression itself is also something that can cause erectile dysfunction. So I feel that a lot of these people were already experiencing these side effects, but they just became more conscientious of them when they started taking finasteride, and then they had some scapegoat to blame it all on. So keep in mind that like there's almost no drug out there that doesn't have like a litany of people claiming it's caused like every adverse side effect that they can possibly imagine. Finasteride is no exception, so don't be afraid of like finasteride. It's really the best treatment we have. Side effects are extremely rare, and keep in mind that there are millions and millions and millions of men who suppress their DHT just suppress their DHT with no side effects whatsoever. And there's actually even populations of people who just do not produce as much of the alpha-5 reductase enzyme as it is. That's just part of their genetics, and they still are able to function completely normally as adults. So DHT's role in the developed adult is obscure. It's not well known, but it's obviously not a very important hormone like testosterone is, because nobody can suppress their testosterone without severe side effects. And the next thing I want to go over is just throwing the whole kitchen sink at it. And, you can do that if you want, but just keep in mind that, like, when it comes to treatments, like I said, it is a lifetime commitment. So if you had to just use finasteride, for instance, that's just like popping an aspirin. You just take a pill once a day, and then you forget about it. So let's say you decide, okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to try minoxidil, I'm going to try stamoxetine mixed in with RU5841, I'm going to try dutasteride, I'm going to go ahead and try everything I can, everything that has been known to work even a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and throw everything at it, because I want to use every weapon at my disposal to fight male pattern baldness. And as someone who's been dealing with male pattern baldness for a while, I think a lot of these people don't know what they're getting themselves into, because after a while it becomes a real pain in the ass to have to use these treatments on a day-to-day basis. And if you want to be able to adhere to a good treatment, you want to make sure that your treatment options are realistic in the sense that you can stick with them for a long period of time. So as far as the more advanced treatment options go, that's something you only want to do if the simpler treatment options before just did not work for you. So don't throw the kitchen sink in it. Just start with finasteride and see how it goes. And lastly, and one second, I just wet my whistle a little bit. Lastly, the next thing I want to talk about is the whole just shave it bro thing. The just shave it bro is basically taking a bias and replacing it with another bias. And I really just despise this, because I feel that the last thing you want to tell somebody who's fighting to maintain something they find desirable, such as their identity, and your hair is part of your identity. Even if you're a bald guy, there was at least a point in your life for a good period of time, up until your teens at the very worst, where you had hair. So everybody's initial identity is going to be defined in part by their hair. And some people may not give a shit, and if you don't give a shit, that's fine. But a lot of people really, really do care about it. I mean, if not, there wouldn't be a multi-million-dollar industry behind like hair product, or multi-billion-dollar industry behind hair products. It's obviously very important to people. And the last thing I think you want to tell people or listen to is you want to ignore people who tell you to just quit, because quitting something that you find is giving up on something that you're trying to fight for is never a desirable thing, whether it be like hair loss or anything. I mean, just think about it. If you're at the gym, and you're at the gym because you want to get healthier, you want to improve your mobility, you want to improve like your muscular definition, and then you find out, oh, it's really, really hard. Doing these movements is very, very difficult. And then somebody comes up to you and say, you know what, man, just fuck it. Just go ahead and rock the dad bro bod and everything. I mean, you'd laugh at the guy. You'd think that's a terrible idea. And you should laugh at these people who are telling you to just shave it, bro, because the truth is that most of these people are either just completely ignorant towards hair loss. They're not dealing with hair loss. They may be women who just haven't thought about it one way or the other, or they're people who are bald themselves, and they've decided to like basically just lie to themselves and convince themselves that since they're bald, everybody else should just accept being bald. But the fact is that the bald look isn't for everybody. A lot of these people that are cited, these celebrities that they cite, like like Jason Statham, The Rock, Bruce Willis, Jean-Luc Picard, I don't know, you name it. The thing is, they've been bald for so long is that we've established that already as part of their identity. And if you're like a very virile looking guy and you have very good cosmetic features, chances are you can look good despite being bald. But the fact is that even if you look good as a bald man, chances are you'd still look better with hair. So don't just give up, don't quit. It's something that's worth fighting for. How valuable it is, that's really up to you, but don't lie to yourself and say that like hair doesn't matter, because otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video to begin with, most likely. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that's an annoying obstacle that a lot of people have to deal with. All right, so moving on. All right, so let's say that you've been trying the pharmaceutical options, and maybe they're helping you maintain your hair, but you've already lost a good deal of hair. That's why I want to introduce the Norwood scale. I know a lot of you guys are already familiar with this. Now, a Norwood 1, a lot of people say Norwood 0. There's no such thing as Norwood 0, but a Norwood 1 is established as no male pattern baldness. So that's going to mean like a completely straight hairline and no hair loss whatsoever. And it's hard to determine whether or not you have genetic male pattern baldness. I mean, just because your parents, you come from a family with no male pattern baldness doesn't mean you're not going to get it. I mean, that definitely improves your chances, but it's no sure bet. So anyways, as you can see, Norwood 2 is when you start to get a bit of a receded hairline, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And by the time you get to Norwood 7, that's when you're completely bald. Now, keep in mind, when you're getting a hair transplant, you're replacing what is lost, and typically what you lost is going to be in the classical male pattern baldness fashion. So people, when they have male pattern baldness, they typically lose hair around the temple first, and then the temple meets the crown, and then it joins together until like there's an island on the front, and then that falls off, and then you're completely bald. So for every Norwood you wish to gain, you're going to need about 1,200 to 1,600 grafts per Norwood, and that information comes from my doctor when he talked to me about my transplant. And because I was in Norwood 3 before my transplant, and I needed about 1,600 grafts to go from a Norwood 3 to a Norwood 2, and I'm a Norwood 2 right now. And I know that if I were to wait like a really long time, if I were like a Norwood 6 or a Norwood 7, then I would not have had enough grafts to actually recover all my hair. And that's why I really stress that time is of the essence if you want to fight male pattern baldness, because you may not have enough grafts available on the back of your head to actually fight male pattern baldness. So that doesn't mean things are hopeless if you are like in the late stages of like a Norwood 5 or Norwood 6 or Norwood 7, but things are going to be a lot more difficult. But that doesn't mean there are no options. So first thing I want to go over when talking about hair transplants, or the things to avoid, is that first thing you want to do is that you want to make sure that you avoid like the hair transplant companies, the ones that are marketed on TV like Hair Club and Bosley, because thing is, like, lots of doctors work for them, and they may actually get you and like the results on their website, they'll show you results from like their very best doctors, but there's also a lot of like really crappy doctors who may work for that company, and there's no guarantee that the person that they situate you with is going to be like a good doctor. So you really are kind of playing Russian roulette with your hair, so it's not worth it. And also another thing you want to do is that you want to avoid choosing doctors based on your location, and of course that's conditional. I mean, if you live somewhere like in California, or like you live in Turkey where there's a lot of good hair transplant doctors, you may very well be able to get away with choosing a doctor based on your location, but good hair transplant doctors are not that terribly common, so there's a good chance there may not be one available that's within driving distance. So make sure you do your research online. Speaking of which, I want to also mention that choosing doctors that don't have good reviews or any testimonials, or have like dubious before and after pictures, and that can be described as like pictures where the lighting is a little bit different, or they have like different angles for the after shot to like kind of hide cosmetic blemishes. You want to make sure you choose doctors that have been in the industry for a long time. There's a lot of good reviews. Maybe they have forums where people can talk about their results, and make sure they're forums where like people don't get moderated for like filing complaints or anything like that. And make sure that the doctor has a lot of good testimonials as well, because hair transplant really is a medical art. And so there's not going to be that many doctors who are super skilled with it. So you just want to make sure you do your research properly. All right. And going over the basic hair transplant options, you have a FUT, a follicular unit transplantation, as well as the newer, groovier transplant option, which is the follicular unit extraction. And generally, the FUE is seen as better for most cases. However, the FUT may be desirable in certain conditions. So, for one thing, it's cheaper. It's about 1/3 the cost per graft compared to an FUE. So, a FUE is significantly more expensive. And as a result of that, It's good for larger procedures, like usually about $3 US per graft, I think is standard. And of course, the big problem with FUTs is that they're just flat out brutal. They take a big chunk of meat off the back of your head, and it's going to leave a scar tissue. It's going to leave like a big smiley face on the back of your head. And you can like hide that if you grow your hair long enough, but if you ever keep your hair short, everybody's going to see that scar, and it's going to be a little bit too symmetrical for you to be able to like say it's because of like some war injury or something. I mean, people are going to think it. People are probably going to know it's from a hair transplant or for some sort of surgical. It's going to be some sort of surgical scar, and because it's so brutal, that also means a long recovery time. You may have to like take a couple weeks off from work or so, and some people just don't have that option, so that kind of sucks. And going into the FUE, like I do see that as the better option for most people. Like if you need a procedure where you just need like 1 to 2,000 grafts or so, the FUE I think is the better choice. If you need like something larger, like 2,000, I mean like 3,000, 4,000 grafts, then you may want to do the FUT unless like you're super rich, because FUE is going to be very expensive. It could be like as much as $20,000 if you need like a very expensive procedure. So it's good for smaller procedures, and that's like anywhere from like 1,000, 2,000 grafts. And the good thing about it is that there's going to be no scar tissue, although you could get some pock markets on your scalp. They're pretty hard to notice, and even if you grow your hair just a little bit shorter, I mean just with a little bit of length, you could pretty much hide all of it. And of course, like another problem with it is that other than just being very expensive is the fact that a lot of doctors are lacking experience because it's a newer procedure. So there may be some doctors who insist on the FUT just because they have a lot more experience with that. So make sure you have a doctor who has a lot of experience performing FUEs. Sometimes they do it with the help of robots. Some people have mixed opinions about using robots for FUEs. I mean, I think they're fine right there. The Artist robot, I think specifically, is the robot that's used in a lot of FUE transplants, and I don't think there's a big issue with them. It's really still an issue with the quality of the doctor. So if you have a good doctor and he knows how to do FUEs, then it shouldn't be an issue. All right, so going into other transplant options. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the transplant section that one big problem is that there's not enough grafts for a lot of people. So if you're like a Norwood 4, Norwood 5, or if like you progress beyond that, you can get grafts from other parts of the body. One option are body hair transplants, and these can be like obtained in the same way the hairs are obtained at the back of your head. And there's a couple problems with the body hair, though, is that they don't grow as long as hair on your head, and they tend to have a coarse texture. So if you want to make it look cosmetically presentable, you have to keep your hair short. Otherwise, the hair on the side of your head is going to grow longer than the hair on the top of your head, and that's going to look absolutely ridiculous, of course. And another option, which I think is better, is facial hair transplants. And the reason why is because the facial hair is going to have a similar texture and growth rate as well as color as the hair on your head. And there's not a terribly large number of grafts on your face, but it could be good, like if you're combining it with the grafts on the back of your head. And of course, the only real downside, though, is that you pretty much won't ever be able to grow a beard ever again. I mean, that may not be a big issue for some people. Some people don't even grow good facial hair to begin with, and some people actually really hate shaving, so that might actually be a plus for them. So those are a couple options to consider if you want to do a surgical option, but you don't have enough grafts on the back of your head. So now, with that being said, I'm going to get into the non-drug and non-surgery options, and I guess it's debatable about whether or not this is surgery. I don't really consider it surgery right here, but a popular trend in the hair loss community is scalp micropigmentation, and I've talked about it before, and if you heard me talk about it, I'll tell you it's just complete bullshit. And I don't think there really is anything positive about it at all. And the biggest problem with it is that hair, even when it's shaved down to the grain, is supposed to be three-dimensional. And so that means that there's always going to be some visual contrast between the hair on the top of your head as well as the hair on the side of your head, because the hair on the side of your head actually is still there. It's still hair. It's not just black dots on the top of your head. And as a result of that, it's just going to look fake. It's just not going to look like it's really hair. It's going to look a little bit too flat. It's like the light's going to reflect off of it too easily. And another big problem is that like you have to keep the side of your head short forever, so you're going to have to basically just shave. I mean, if you hate shaving, you're going to really hate it when you have to shave the sides of your head every day. And another big problem with that is that since it's permanent and it's going to be like black dots forever, is that like when you go gray, it's going to look really stupid, because like basically your only option is to basically dye the side of your head. I mean, like basically try to like maybe get a new procedure where they can do gray dots. I don't even think they really do that. So, or you can just dye the side of your head like the same color as the black dots on the top of your head. But anyways, I really don't think you guys should do this. I mean, if you really want to do it, go ahead. But you know, I've seen a lot of people who have had like the scalp micropigmentation, and even from good doctors, I think it looks completely ridiculous. It looks fake as hell. It stands out like a sore thumb, and it's just a terrible option in my opinion. So I don't recommend this in the slightest. Now, another option, and this isn't like really an option if you've lost a significant amount of hair, but one thing that can help improve the cosmetic appearance of your hair, as well as something that could help if you're a diffuse thinner. Now, diffuse thinner is somebody who's not really losing hair in a particular pattern, but someone who's just losing hair all over. These concealers work extremely well for diffuse thinners, but they can actually be beneficial for anyone experiencing any kind of hair loss, and even people who don't experience hair loss, because I think they tend to improve just the cosmetic appearance of a lot of the hair. You can think of them as like makeup for the hair. So the first two I want to go over are Topic and Kabuki. Topic Kabuki, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but anyways, they're basically the same. They're topical colored keratin, and keratin is like what your hair is made out of. So the way they work is that they bind to your hair follicles, and they just give the hair a thicker appearance. So it's really good if you're balding on the crown, or if you're a diffuse thinner, like I said. But I think they tend to look like hell on the hairline. They're just not a really good hairline choice, because if you have like nothing on the front of your scalp and you just spray powder on it, it's not going to look that good. And Derm Match is a little better on the hairline, but that's more of like a scalp paint. So what it does is that it basically just paints your scalp the same color as your hair, so it just gives the illusion of more density. I tend to think it looks a little bit better, and it is a little bit better for the hairline. So if you're looking for a good hairline concealer, I think Derm Match is a much better option. And I think it's very important to make sure that you're not using too much of any of these. Otherwise, you kind of give your hair like a dirty Topic look. It looks kind of powdery. It's going to look a little bit dry. And if you're using Topic and Kabuki, you need to use a lot of hairspray. And if you use a lot of hairspray, it's going to give your like head like kind of like a helmet hair like kind of look right there, and that's not very good. And I think that if you're like in kind of like a dimly lit area, like a bar or a club, that's when like it's probably best to use these treatments, because that's when it's harder to notice like the kind of the powdery texture. But of course, a big drawback with concealers is that if you're using a concealer and you're also using topicals, it may be harder to apply the topicals just because there's like powder on your hair, and that may get in the way of like the chemical being able to actually touch the scalp. So just keep in mind the limitations when using concealers when you're using topicals. So anyways. The next non-surgical option I want to talk about are hair systems. Now, hair system sounds like some sort of like really extensive treatment, but what it is just a euphemism for a very high quality wig. And I want to give a picture right here just to demonstrate how ridiculously good these look. So I feel that this is a really good last resort option for people who for whatever reason, let's say they can't use drugs, surgery is either too expensive or it's not really an option for them. And let's say they want to get something that gives them the illusion of having hair without when they don't really have the option to maintain any more hair or get their hair back through surgery or through any other means. And it looks really, really good. And of course, there's no surgery or drugs, so there's going to be no side effects or anything like that. And I think it's a good option for people when surgery and drugs are not an option. But like any treatment, there are going to be some drawbacks. I mean, you have to keep the hair on the side proportional, because the hair is still going to grow. And for a lot of people, it's not going to really feel natural, because you're basically taking like a chemical and you're basically gluing something to your scalp. And if you get like some itchy scalp, that could be a real pain in the ass. And another big problem is that it could be embarrassing, because you know you don't want anyone to find out that you're wearing a wig, because there's stigma about that, which is ridiculous, because you know women wear wigs all the time and nobody really gives a damn, but they don't lose hair nearly as often as men do. Yet for some reason there's a lot of stigma about men wearing wigs. So as a result of that, people may feel like it might be something embarrassing to hide, and they just don't want to have to deal with that extra like potential embarrassment. And also, a hair transplant, a hair system is something that needs to be replaced. I think it's like every 6 months or so, just because it starts to fall apart eventually, and you need to like re-glue it. And you know, if like after a while, it could actually get a little detached from the scalp. So it's not perfect, but I'm telling you, if I had to choose between a hair system and scalp micropigmentation, I would much rather go for a hair system. All right, so that pretty much sums up everything I want to talk about in this video. But I just, it was a very long video, so just giving a too long didn't read version. What I want people to take away from this video more than anything is, for one, start with the most basic treatments first. So that means don't like throw the kitchen sink at it. Just start with finasteride, and after like several months, if finasteride doesn't work or so, maybe consider some adjunct treatments like minoxidil. But finasteride is a viable option for overwhelmingly the majority of people who are dealing with male pattern baldness. It's a great drug, so always start with finasteride first. Next, don't panic, don't give up, don't worry about the initial shed. That's just part of like that's just part of the process of saving your hair, and that's a sign that the treatment is working. So try to look at it optimistically, and don't give up. Don't listen to all the assholes who are trying to drag you down to their level by telling you to shave your head or just give up. Hair is something that is obviously valuable for you, so you should resent people who tell you to give up on something that's important to you. You wouldn't give up on anything else that is important to you, so you shouldn't give up on this either. Hair loss, contrary to popular belief, is actually fairly easy to treat, especially if you catch it early. So make sure you don't quit, and weigh all your options, and just make sure that you ignore all the naysayers out there who think that who try to stigmatize the idea of saving your hair. And of course, weigh surgical options carefully, and surgery should be an option for people who have lost too much hair to be saved through pharmaceutical options. And make sure that you are choosing the right doctor, doing the proper research, make sure there's good reviews for the doctor, good testimonials, and also make sure that you make the right educated choice when choosing between an FUE or an FUT. An FUE, of course, being better for smaller procedures, and an FUT being better for larger procedures. And of course, the most important thing I want to talk about, which I've stressed many, many times before, is that the sooner you begin this fight, the better. Because like with hair loss, time is of the essence, and the longer you wait, the worse it's going to get. And ideally, you don't want to have to do like any surgery. You don't want to have to do any non-surgical treatment options like hair systems or any of that scalp micropigmentation bullshit. You want to be able to like just start treatment and never have to worry about hair loss ever again. And that's why I say that, like, you should probably just start like finasteride, like if you have even like an inkling of suspicion that you have male pattern baldness, because once you lose hair, there's a very good chance you won't be able to grow it back. You may just at best be able to maintain what you have. So the sooner you begin the fight, the better. Do not delay. Begin the fight. My biggest regret, and I think the biggest regret of most people who have been fighting hair loss for a long time, is that they did not start the fight sooner. So anyways, that's all I wanted to say about that, and I hope you guys found it informative, and good luck on your hair loss journey.